He told me I was old news over a sink full of plates, as if age could be rinsed away with soap and sent down the drain. I was folding a dish towel the way I always folded them, corners meeting like quiet promises. And his voice cut the kitchen into sharp, thin pieces. I had been a wife for 27 years, a mother who stepped back at school concerts, a woman who baked for church potlucks and kept the garden tidy. We had built our life in a quiet Texas suburb, the kind of place where everyone knew whose porch light stayed on the latest. I was also the woman who had a travel magazine folded under her stack of recipes, pages dog-eared at Florence and the Amalfi Coast, a small private map of what I had wanted for years. That map changed hands the night he said the words. That was the night I stopped seeing myself as background and quietly started planning my own escape. Stay with me until the end, subscribe to Mature Justice, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. When he left, he hadn't packed much. A carry-on, 2 shirts, and the sort of smile practiced for departure. He told me it was a work trip. He called it a quick thing. He kissed my cheek like he was checking off a box. I watched the taillights of the car, his car, until they vanished around the corner. I folded the towel and laid it on the counter as if that small motion would stitch the frayed seam of the house back together. The first humiliation came soft and sly. It was a throwaway at dinner, a remark about women our age being content with slippers and daytime television. He laughed at his own joke. The room laughed where it needed to. There were other slips, a disgusted glance when I reached for a high shelf, a sentence unfinished when he decided I wouldn't understand brand names or bank apps. It built like damp behind wallpaper, slow, undermining, invisible until the paint began to bubble. I felt myself pulling inward, making myself smaller on purpose so that his light, whatever it was, would not notice me. It felt like survival then. It felt like training. The discovery was not cinematic. It did not involve a dramatic nod of keys or a receipt dropped like a clue. I overheard a call in the early hours, a phone left on a counter, a laugh that sounded too soft and too familiar. He had always been a careful talker, but the voice on the other end slipped in like a shutter left open. "See you in Florence," I heard, and something in me clarified all at once. Florence, Italy. The pages of the magazine suddenly had a sound. My stomach lurching didn't feel like betrayal at first, so much as a sudden, embarrassing education. I had been reading the wrong textbooks for the life I thought I was building. I did not storm out with accusations. That would have been theatrical, and I had spent years learning not to be carried away by spectacle. Instead, I did what I always did when faced with the unknown. I counted. I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper and listed what I could touch, what I owned outright, what was in my name on paper. The list was practical. My savings account that had been in my name since my mother left me a little nest egg, the little sedan I drove to the grocery store, the box of old letters in the attic. The list was also tender. Painting class on Thursday nights, the rose bush along the fence that bloomed despite my forgetfulness, the quiet laugh I had when my sister sent a stupid text. In the very next 24 hours, while he thought I was just folding towels and watering roses, I moved every dollar that was legally mine into accounts in my name only, booked an appointment with a lawyer, and decided that the car he worshipped like a trophy would soon be gone from our driveway. The neighbor, Ruth, found me over the fence with my hands in the soil, scraping at the roots of something that had been planted by the house's former owner. "You look like you could use a plan," she said, as if she had been waiting for me to say the words out loud. Ruth is the kind of woman who wears sensible shoes and tells the truth like a gift. She squeezed my hand and told me I wasn't the first to wake up with her own life asleep beside her. She brought a thermos of coffee and a list of people: a sister's name, a lawyer who did things by the book, a mechanic with no patience for excuses, and a soft spot for honest work. I remember the moment I made the first real move. It felt a little like stepping off a curb into wind. I drove to the bank with my heart in my throat, the paper with account numbers folded against my breast. The bank smelled of lemon cleaner and paper. The teller recognized me. How could she not? And when I asked about options for securing the funds that were mine, she gave me a businesslike smile and a folder. I left with an appointment at a branch where a manager could adjust signatories if accounts were joint. I closed a small separate account and rolled the money into a new savings that bore only my name. None of it felt like vengeance. It felt like drawing a line on a map and deciding which way I would walk from it. Selling the car was more symbolic than necessary. The convertible he'd always loved, the one he'd polished on Sundays and joked about as if it were a secret chandelier at our house, was indeed registered in both our names on a title signed long ago when I had thought it was romantic to share everything. But paper has a way of keeping secrets. In an old drawer, I found the original purchase documents that listed my name first. He had never corrected it. He had assumed the shine would obscure the print. I took the title to a buyer Ruth knew, a young man who had a bar where he played small jazz standards on Wednesday nights. The exchange was brisk, the cash into an account that now bore my initials. It was not flashy. The car had given him a look, a posture, an avenue to show off to women half his age. In handing over those keys, I felt the weight of a decade of small humiliations slip into the palm of someone who wanted a weekend toy. He thanked me as if he had done me a favor. I smiled a tight, private smile. There were practicalities that required legal counsel. I called the lawyer Ruth suggested, Evelyn, who wore thick glasses and had a laugh like a statement of purpose. She listened and then gave me a sequence of things to do. Don't be dramatic at the same time as filing. Document, document, document. Do not allow a sudden unilateral transfer of shared assets without notice. Keep receipts. Make sure your legal address is correct. She did not promise fireworks. She promised method. That grounded me. When she asked me what I wanted, I surprised myself with the answer: stability, not spectacle. I wanted the house to be secure for the years I lived in it, the garden to remain mine to tend, and the freedom to buy a plane ticket if I decided to. It was in the middle of this careful rebuilding that I enrolled in a painting class. I had always been able to approximate a landscape in the margins of a grocery list, a scallop of color with impatient hands, but I had never taken lessons. Thursday nights became an island: paint-splattered smocks, the smell of turpentine, the gentle reprimand of a teacher who told me to look longer at the way light softened across a bowl. I discovered that my hands remembered more than I thought. They remembered how to make a brush do what I wanted, to drag cream into a wash of sky. The class filled a part of me that had been cataloged as hobby and therefore unessential. It was the place I practiced daring in small strokes. My sister came down from Houston one weekend with suitcases and a cooler full of casseroles. She sat on my porch with a cup of sweet tea while I trimmed dead petals from the roses. "You are not defined by his mouth," she said simply, as if defining me were the easiest thing in the world. Her words were not a bomb, they were a map. She helped me unpack the attic box of letters and photographs, which became a quiet liturgy of memory. The way I had laughed with friends at 20, the photograph of my mother by the sea, the recipe for lemon bars in my grandmother's handwriting. We ate lemon bars and made a plan that involved small, steady steps. She insisted on going with me to see the lawyer, sitting in the waiting room like a bodyguard made of soft-spoken affection. There was a careful choreography to what I did next. I transferred funds that were in accounts solely in my name into the new savings. I documented strange charges on the credit card I suspected might be connected to the trip. I put copies of my birth certificate and our marriage certificate into a folder and gave it to Evelyn to hold. People I trusted, Ruth, my sister, Evelyn, became a net under me. When I began to feel the old panic creep back, I would call them and say nothing more than, "Do you have time for a cup of coffee?" And they would come, bearing casseroles and silence. There was a funny, small moment that felt like an initiation into a new mindset. I stood in my closet one morning, looking at dresses I had worn to charity galas and dinners when my role was to be admired. They hung like ghosts. I pulled one down, an emerald silk that had been a favorite, and tried it on. The dress fit differently than it had 20 years earlier. The seams remembered curves that had changed shape. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not look for his approval. I adjusted the collar, smoothed the fabric, and felt something in me answer back. You are allowed to look good for your own reasons. Days blurred in a steady, purposeful way. I learned to change the water in the vases weekly, to take deliberate walks down streets I had never noticed, to bring home a small loaf of bread from a bakery because I liked the way the crust cracked. I answered his texts in monosyllables at first, and then not at all. The house rearranged itself around me. I spent Saturday afternoons at the garden center, reading labels of plants as if they were scripture: sunlight needs, soil preference, hardiness. I bought a fig tree and planted it where the winter light would find it. It felt audacious to invest in something that would take years to bear fruit. But audacity and patience had become neighbors in my life. His return was not dramatic. He came in wearing the same practiced smile and a cologne that had been designed to be remembered. He set his suitcase down and looked at the house as if he were noticing it for the first time. Florence was wonderful, he said, as if the words might be a talisman. He did not stop to ask how I was. He did not notice the roses had been pruned or that the fig tree had been planted. He opened the refrigerator and found a jar of my sister's pickles and raised an eyebrow like I had been trying to ambush him with domesticity. I had prepared myself for a confrontation, for a scene where the house would become a theater and we would both perform. Instead, I chose to be quiet and precise. I let him talk, and I let him think the conversation was ordinary. When he asked where the little sedan had gone, I told him simply that I had sold it. His forehead folded with a curiosity that suggested both surprise and an assessment. He was weighing whether this was a theft or a kindness. "You sold it?" he said, "without asking me?" I told him the truth in plain sentences. The title listed my name. I sold it to someone who will take better care of it than you did. He looked hurt, as if the loss of the car was an injury done to his narrative of himself. There was a faint, incredulous laugh, like a man trying on indignation for fit. He asked about the money. I told him the money was in an account in my name. He wanted bills, accounting, a ledger. I told him I had spoken with a lawyer and that the house, the plants, the painting supplies, the accounts that were mine were to remain mine unless we negotiated otherwise. He called it dramatic. I called it necessary. There was a moment, small and quiet, that felt like a turning point. He went to the bedroom and picked up a garment from a chair and paused, looking at a photograph on the nightstand. It was a wedding photo. Us, younger, hair different, faces full of a kind of hope. He put his hand on the frame, as if he were considering the distance between then and now. I did not pull him into the past. I folded a towel and slid it into the linen closet, the motion unremarkable and ordinary. My calm was not cowardice. It was a ledger entry, one action, one consequence. The escalation came in paper and signatures rather than raised voices. The lawyer filed for a legal separation and sent notice. There were forms that demanded my handwriting, documents that asked for an inventory of what I considered essential to my life. I listed the fig tree, the painting easel, the chest of recipe cards. He objected through the lens of entitlement, as if the things I cherished were an affront to his ego. I found it odd, and then I found it freeing. The quarrel had become less about taking and more about naming. I was practicing the verb of claiming. People offered opinions as if they were medicines, some sharp, some sweet. My friends told me to be careful. My sister told me to be shrewd. Ruth told me to plant more roses. None of them told me to be vindictive. There was no joy in revenge for me. That was a drama I had always refused to rehearse. I wanted dignity and the ability to wake up and make coffee in a kitchen that reflected my choices. There was a patience in that desire that felt almost holy. The night before the court date, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile and a sketchbook. I had been practicing a small Tuscan landscape in muted ochres and warm grays, imagination doing the work of travel. I painted the suggestion of a stone wall and a lone cypress, the way the light falls at a certain hour. I did not want to flee to Italy. I wanted to invite Italy inside me. The painting, once completed, looked like a place you might visit for an afternoon and then return home from, carrying a piece of it in your pocket. The day of the meeting with the banker, the lawyer, and the court clerk was procedural. My sister drove me there and held my hand in the lobby with a strength that made the fluorescent lights less harsh. The paperwork slid across desks and found signatures. There were moments of worry. What if he fought? What if he tried to claim more than was reasonable? And moments of quiet confidence as Evelyn walked me through language I had not known how to speak before. "This is not about punishing him," she said. "This is about securing your life." The way she said it made my chest unclench. When the immediate legality settled into a tentative order, I allowed myself to be small and foolish in a way I hadn't been permitted to be in a long time. I booked a weekend at a little bed and breakfast on the coast, not in Italy, but close enough to salt and wind and the kind of horizon that makes you feel less heavy. I brought my sketchbook and a new dress and a curiosity that was not for anyone but myself. On the first morning, I walked the shoreline and listened to the waves perform the same honest work every day. I felt the stitches of my heart set in place by repetition and light and the stubborn intelligence of small things. There was no bombastic reveal when he returned from that trip with his secretary, no longer just a roomer but an occupant of his weekends. He walked into the house and found certain things had changed. My bank accounts were under my control. The garden had new life. The painting easel took up permanent residence in the corner of the living room where he used to leave newspapers. He asked questions. I answered. When he reached for the subject of the car he'd loved, he found an empty corner where the leather smell had been. He ran his hand across the space like someone feeling for a warmth that had been taken. "You did all this while I was gone?" he asked, the accusation thin as paper. I told him gently that I had done it for me. He called it selfish. I called it clarity. He tried to negotiate in the language of charm, compliments, nostalgic mentions of the early years, the way we had once camped under stars. I did not deny that we had been young and bright together. I simply named what I wanted now. The right to make plans without being diminished for years past, the ability to travel if I chose, the freedom to be seen as my own person. He flinched at that because it required him to make room for someone he had not expected to share life with in that way. I would find later that the small, decisive acts, selling the convertible, securing accounts, enrolling in painting, had done more than rearrange property. They had altered how I perceived myself. There was a slowness to the change, an accretion of small victories. A neighbor complimenting my roses, a student in my painting class asking to buy a small study, a baker down the street recognizing me and waving. My life began to be punctuated by choices I had made for myself rather than ones I made because someone else would approve. There were evenings when the house echoed with absence. I would stand in the doorway of our bedroom and see the imprint of the life we had shared. books lined on shelves, the corner where his slippers always sat. And I would feel a sadness that was not indignation, but mourning. I allowed myself to mourn. Mourned the years wasted, the kindnesses unnoticed, the small daily erosions that had felt inevitable. But mourning did not become my identity. It was a guest who left when I stood at the easel and began again. Months passed in a rhythm of small restorations. The fig tree produced a tentative leaf the following spring. I painted a larger canvas that captured the light hitting a porch swing at dusk. I traveled once, on a ticket I bought for myself, to a small town by the sea where the children ran with dogs and the baker knew my name after 2 days. It was not Florence, but it was a place I chose on my terms. When friends asked what had changed the most, I always answered the same: language. I had learned to say yes to myself and no to being diminished. I had learned that dignity was a practical thing: money in an account, a lawyer who knew how to file papers, a fig tree planted in a place where it could grow. Those were not glamorous victories, but they were the sort that hold you steady through the cold months. I thought, often, of the magazine with Florence on its glossy pages. For a while, it had been a talisman of everything I had not yet allowed myself. After the year of quiet, it became a motif in my studio, a small painting inspired by a cobbled street, colors borrowed and claimed. The dream had shifted from being a destination I needed to prove I could reach to being a mood I could cultivate at home. A table set with bread and good cheese, a window that allowed light in at the right angle, friends who came for dinner. There were no fireworks at the end of our separation. There was a contract, signatures, and the slow settling of paper into files. He left with dignity offended and a trunk of his own decisions. I kept the house and the fig tree and a painting that hung above the mantel, a landscape I had made in ochres and blues. It had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with continuity. On a Sunday in late summer, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and listened to the bees work the roses. The air smelled like lemon and paint and the kind of peace that is chosen, not granted. If you are hearing this and feel the weight of being dismissed because of your age or your role, know this: the steps are often quieter than you imagine, and the victories are steadier when they are yours. You do not have to make a spectacle to be seen. You can register your name on an account, plant a tree that will bear fruit years from now, sign up for a class that teaches your hands new language. The map to a life reclaimed is made of small, deliberate acts. Tonight, when I walk to the easel and mix a new color, I think of how strange it is to be surprised by my own courage. I think of my sister leaning on the porch rail, Ruth's thermos, Evelyn's quick questions like a surgeon's tools. I think of the magazine, its pages now tacked to my studio wall, like a reminder that some dreams are seeds you carry and plant when the ground is ready. I do not tell the story for revenge. I tell it because somewhere, someone will fold a towel, hear a phrase, and decide they deserve more than polite silence. If that is you, then plant your fig tree. Start your painting. Take the paperwork to a room that will listen. I am not finished telling you everything. There were more small reckonings and a quiet confrontation I saved for the day he would understand the limits of charm. But the next part of the story starts with me handing over keys and watching taillights fade, and with a choice about what to do with the space left behind. I will tell you what happened when I watched that car disappear, and why the morning after felt like the first day of a long, honest life. The morning after felt like the first day of a long, honest life because the mirror no longer held someone waiting to be corrected. It held me, person by person. The small, clear lines around my eyes from years of squinting at canvases, the unpadded shoulders that had learned to carry groceries and stretch ladders and cradle a sleeping niece. I made coffee with deliberate movements, the kettle singing a clean domestic note. The porch was a study in ordinary miracles. Bees along the roses, a neighbor sweeping her stoop, the fig tree throwing a new cluster of leaves toward the sun. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote, not lists of tasks, but 2 frank sentences. What will you keep? What will you refuse? Sorting was a ceremony. I opened drawers and found the quiet archaeology of a life. Receipts for dinners I did not remember enjoying, a ticket stub from a film he had claimed was our thing, a postcard from a city he had never taken me to. I folded shirts with the precision of someone who had learned to honor objects without being owned by them. There were things I kept because they mattered, a mug with a chip that fit my hand like an old joke, and things I boxed for the charity shop. I left him a small packet with the rest on the back step, tied with twine and labeled with a note I did not expect him to read and one I did not need him to answer. Take what you want, leave the rest. Weeks braided into months. My mornings began with paint and coffee and the list of small reckonings. Schedule the dentist, call the accountant, water the fig. I took a class on etching because my hands wanted a new language. Ruth came on Sundays and sat on the porch rail with her thermos. She asked questions that were precise as scalpels and soft as bandages. Evelyn called with practical counsel, how to change account names, whom to call about removing a name from an insurance policy, and she dropped off lemon cookies shaped like little suns. Friends visited with casseroles and books and an unassuming rigor. They showed up and left the place tidier than it had been before. The studio became the place where the past and future negotiated terms. I painted a series of canvases that were not attempts to forget him, but maps of where I had placed my feet while he was still talking. A table with a single chair, a window that let in the right kind of late light, a portrait of the porch swing where I had learned to sit and be steady. People began to notice. Neighbors who had seen me through coffee and quiet nodded approval. A small gallery owner from town, a friend of a friend, asked if I would show a handful of pieces in an autumn group exhibition. It was modest. White walls, wooden floors scuffed by the traffic of other people's lives, a pot of black coffee somewhere in the back. It felt like an extension of my home rather than a proving ground. On the night of the opening, the town was practicing its small civic pageantry. Lamps lit in front of shops, string lights above the square, a violinist playing a few measures of a song somebody hummed along to. People I loved were there. Ruth in a green coat with paint still under her nails, Evelyn with an armful of friends and that quick, efficient laugh of hers. The canvas over the mantel, the ochres and blues that had once been simply continuity, now had faces and remarks attached to it. Someone said, "There's honesty in your blues," and I wanted to answer that I had learned to call the color by its name. He arrived sometime after the first drink, quiet, as he always had been when he wanted to be allowed back into a room without making an entrance. He stood near the doorway and looked as if he were taking inventory. My people, my paintings, my steadiness. There was a small, almost affectionate curl at the corner of his mouth, the way he looked at objects he thought he had once owned. For a moment, I watched him as if he were one of the paintings, someone whose surface told a story, not always the whole one. He crossed the room. "You look well," he said, as though this could be folded into a compliment and placed on a table between two people who shared a history. "I am well," I replied. The words fell into the space like measured stones. They were true and they were unassailable. He tilted his head, the gesture of a man who had convinced himself that interest could pass for effort. "I was surprised to see the show," he said. "It's good." "Are you surprised or surprised for yourself?" I asked, because I had learned that precision was a form of mercy. He blinked. Charm had been his way of stopping a conversation before it started. It had been for him the polite icing over the place where an apology might have sat. "I only came to say hello," he began. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Silence is a kind of clarity, and sometimes clarity does the work of a reprimand. He laughed, small and nervous. I thought it better to show up. Show up for what? To confirm that he could still step into my life and find an audience? To watch me receive polite applause and imagine I might look smaller than I did in fact feel? The questions pooled in me like clear water. I could have walked him through the long list of things he had missed. The quiet betrayals, the eroded kindnesses, the nights I had taken cold dinners to my mouth while he sat somewhere else telling stories about his day. I had rehearsed the confrontation I saved for when charm would stumble and the facts would stand upright between us. I had saved it for a time when I would not need to make noise to be heard. "Do you remember the gray shirt?" I asked instead. He frowned. "Which one?" "The one you left in the closet for 3 winters and then criticized because it wasn't mine." A memory moved across his face, quick like light across a wall. Yes, I suppose I did," he said, uncomfortable. "You called it unambitious," I told him. "You called my choices that. You said we would be fine, and then left the small things undone until they looked like character flaws." His jaw tightened. "I said a lot of things. We had problems." "We did," I agreed. "But problems are not always mutual. Some of us carry them differently. You left. You left a trunk and a dignity you thought would follow. I kept a house and the work of learning how to be myself. That is not the same thing as taking revenge. It is inventory." He tried to line up his charm, soft apologies, a reminiscence about a trip that never quite materialized. It fell short because it was being used as a bridge across a gulf of facts that could not be spanned by nostalgia. For the first time in the long years of his small evasions, I saw the thing that had sometimes been masked by his ease, not malice, but a remarkable capacity for only agreeing with the contours that benefited him. "You're angry," he said, as if it explained. "I'm not angry in the way you might hope," I answered. "I'm accurate." The word landed. Accuracy felt generous and precise. He shifted his weight, as if the room had been rearranged. There was a pause, a small rearrangement of memories. He looked at the paintings as if hoping to find his reflection softened by canvas. Perhaps he had expected a row of apologies waiting in the wings, ready to step forward when he asked. Instead, there was my work, steady and unapologetic, not pleading. There was nothing to flatter him with and nothing to confess. "I wish you well," he said, because that was the language of people who wanted to leave without facing consequence. "And you," I replied. Then I turned to the small cluster of friends who had filled the gallery with murmurs and clinks of glasses. They had watched, not as spectators to a drama, but as witnesses to a line being drawn. No one applauded. The violinist drifted toward another tune. The party resumed its orbit. When I stepped back into the studio the next morning, the light was different for a reason that had nothing to do with weather. It was the clarity that comes when a room has been measured and found to contain only what you chose to place there. I made tea. I unrolled a fresh sheet of paper and sketched the porch swing in one careful stroke. There was no triumph in the line, only the fact of the swing, of its weight and possibility. Outside, the fig tree had a new bud at its tip. In the kitchen, a neighbor shouted that her granddaughter had learned to whistle. Days elongated into a shape I knew how to live in: work, friendship, small administrations of life. I paid attention to the monetary errands and the ceremonial ones, inviting a new friend for soup, returning a borrowed ladder, writing a note to the woman at the bakery because she had learned how I liked my bread. The confrontation had not been a denouement. It was the simple act of naming. It did not convert him. It did not unmake his past. It did, however, dissolve one of the last illusions between us, that charm could substitute for accountability. There were other reckonings, smaller and softer, reconciling what my art promised with what I could deliver, calling my sister when the day felt large and I felt small, sitting with the silence of a room that was finally familiar. Sometimes the town felt too small, and I wanted to buy a plane ticket and ride the idea of escape halfway across the sky. But most mornings, I chose the fig tree and the porch. The life that I had made piece by piece held me. Continuity, I learned, is not a race to a finish line. It is a methodical practice of showing up to your own days, again and again, and doing the work of tending them. The magazine page stayed on my wall. It was no longer a talisman of places to reach, but a map of light I could carry with me. I taped a new note beside it: plant, paint, pay, call. It read like a modest litany, and it steadied me. When dusk came and the porch swing creaked with the weight of the day, I would sit and let my hands be empty for a little while. There would be more paintings to make and more small mercies to accept. I did not pretend the road ahead would be without thorn or shadow. I only knew with a quiet, unshakable certainty that it would be walked in my name. And so the mornings kept happening, plain, brave, uncelebrated. The fig tree grew its leaves. I learned a new shade of blue that only appeared at a certain hour of twilight. People came to look at the paintings. The phone rang, sometimes with good news, sometimes with matters that required a ledger and a polite letter. Life returned to its ordinary density. I had not sought spectacle. I had chosen continuity. That choice, made in small domestic acts and exacting conversations, shaped the stillness of my days in a way I could now trust. There were still things to explain to myself, edges to soften, letters to write to people I had once been. But the most important conversations, those with my own hands, my own hours, my own work, were happening. When I went to bed that night, I did not replay his leaving as a wound. I wrapped myself in a blanket that smelled faintly of lemon and paint and thought, tomorrow I will mix a new color. I will plant another cutting beside the fig tree. I will answer the mail. The list was not small, but it was mine. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, remember this: you are never old news in your own life. You are allowed to take back your time, your money, and your peace. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to Mature Justice, like this video, and tell me in the comments which moment of my story hit you the hardest.